sad and devastated and didn't really want to engage in any conversation. But the reporter asked her outright, "Did you have any idea what your husband was planning?" And she said, no, absolutely not. She hadn't. But as I say, may well be that sometime soon we get to see the family themselves come out. But as for now, their whereabouts is still a little unclear.
Mark Worthington in Luton, thanks for joining us.
Now, big cuts to council budgets in England are expected to be announced by the government later. Grants are likely to be reduced by 27% over the next 4 years. The localism bill has also been unveiled, aiming to give people in England more say in their communities. People will be able to question how services like post offices and libraries are run and potentially take them over.
York is already bracing for these cuts. For the next couple of years, money will be very tight. People are starting to think about which local services they really value.
Maybe a bit worried about the things that cover old people and vulnerable adults.
Roads been salted and things like that, I think. It's the main concern, but children's education as well.
Obviously, you don't want to see any services cut. You know, but you have to accept in the current climate that everywhere is going to make changes. Just hope the impact least you can.
In every part of England there are questions about parks, pools, public toilets and potholes. Some services will have to go, but the government says the front line can be protected as councils get more efficient at what they do.
We're expecting local authorities to start to merge their back office services, to have joint chief executives, joint legal departments, joint accountants, planners, human resources. That way we should be able to save the money to ensure that the front line is protected.
Some experts think cutting bureaucracy may not be enough though.
We're going to see spending on perhaps refuse collection. We've heard councils talking about dimming the street lights or putting them off at night in rural areas. So all of the services councils provide, but even social services for the elderly and for children.
All of this comes on the same day the government publishes its localism bill. That will allow community groups to bid to run council services. It will also be easier for people to buy assets like threatened post offices or pubs. And there'll be referendums if local authorities plan big increases in council tax. The government calls this a radical programme. Less money, but more say for local people on how to spend it. Others worry that as power is handed down from Whitehall, so too is the responsibility for cutting services. Mike Sargent, BBC News, York.
Well, let's find out how this is going to affect different parts of the country. In a moment, we'll go to Louise Hubble. She's in Dorset for us. First, though, let's speak to Mike Sargent, who is in York. Mike.
Yes, hello. Well, councils across England are waiting a bit anxiously this afternoon for the financial settlement. They're going to see average cuts of about 10% next year. That's roughly what they're expecting here in York. But overall, the settlement is going to be the toughest, say experts, since the Second World War. Well, let's talk to two people whose organisations might be affected by all of this. David Smith, the General Manager of Our Celebration, a mental health charity. But first, Angela Harrison of York Council Voluntary Services. You work with lots of voluntary groups here in York. What's going to be the impact for you?
Well, groups are very concerned about potential cuts to their funding. Charities work on very tight budgets as it is, and if they could find another 10 to 15% off their budgets, then they would have done that already. So groups are very concerned about potential cuts. And
you think the cuts are essential, or do you think that the cuts are unjustified, that nothing should be cut?
We sympathise with the local authority because they're in a very difficult position having to find such cuts, but we would urge them to take a long-term view, particularly of their funding of the voluntary sector, because it's the short-term nature of the cuts that will prove most difficult for groups.
OK, David Smith, you're a voluntary mental health organisation, so you share similar concerns, I take?
We do, yes. I mean, we've been running for 20-odd years, and we've always had a very good partnership with the local authority. We're hopeful that in light of the cuts that we know they're going to have to make, they do it sensibly, they do it intelligently, and they don't just slice cuts across the board, but try and look at the impact that the cuts are going to make and how it's going to affect the more vulnerable people in the city.
OK, the government says it's combining these cuts with a new push for localism, the so-called big society. Now, that's your big opportunity, isn't it, for voluntary groups to step in where services can't anymore be provided by local authorities?
It is indeed, and what we've been doing has been part of big society for a long time. We're very encouraged by what the government's saying about big society, and we want to be part of it, but to recognise that in order to do that, we do need some resources.
So big society is not that easy, given that funding is shrinking.
Big society is not free, and that's what government needs to remember.
So, we're seeing what the government calls this radical programme of pushing power out from Whitehall. You would sympathise with some of those objectives, but like David, money is very, very tight, so it's going to be hard to realise.
I think the areas around public service delivery and asking charities to take on that work, organisations are very interested in doing that, but they need to be secure in their future and confident that they can survive into the future in order to take on those services.
OK, thank you both very much for joining us here in York. Now, ministers say they can do more for less and are encouraging local authorities to do so, but others, of course, see only a government that's trying to spread around the pain and the blame. Well, let's get a slightly different perspective on all of this with Louise Hubble, my colleague who is in Dorset. Louise.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm here at the New Inn near Bridport, and this is an example of a facility that's been taken over by the local community, and it has been a real success story. This pub shut down 5 years ago. The villagers have worked very hard. They've set up a company to take it over, and it's now at the heart of the village, and you can even pick up your prescription here. Let's go inside and have a chat to some of them. If we just make our way through, we will find the landlord here, Gary Pello. Gary, how hard has this been to get this project up and running?
Oh, there's been a tremendous amount of effort from the villagers as a whole, doing voluntary work, raising funds, getting the whole project off to a running start, and we're very pleased with what we've got.
Excellent. Well, let's cross over now and bring in Ed Buck, and he's a villager who's part of the company that has taken over the running of this pub. And it's been a long process, hasn't it? It's been hard work. The government wants more communities to start taking over things like pubs. How feasible is that, do you think?
I think potentially it's very feasible, yes. If a community can identify itself properly, if the village society is strong, and if they get support from the parish council, they need a powerful vision of what they want to achieve, and then the sky's the limit, really. If they so once they've got the vision, if they've got the will to work and put it all together, then I think anything's possible.
We know more cuts are coming. Would you be tempted to take over anything else? You've already taken over the pub, the mobile library, perhaps?
Well, not personally, no. I think we've got enough on our plates, but things like the local library, I think that maybe smaller communities like ours need to combine to look at problems like that and make sure they safeguard the future as best they can.
OK, Ed, thank you very much for joining us. And just a snapshot, really, here in Dorset of a community that has taken on local facilities. Hard work, as you've heard there. So just how feasible is this to be rolled out elsewhere?
OK, Louise and Mike in York, both of you, thanks very much indeed for that. And with me here in the studio is Steve Freer, Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, everyone knows as CIPFA. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon.
How big are changes are being considered? How big are the changes?
Well, we've just done a survey of local authorities to see how budgets for next year are shaping up. And the picture that it's painting suggests that almost all services are going to be subject to cuts. I think that cuts of around the 10% mark are going to be pretty commonplace, but also we're going to see some much deeper cuts in some areas, particularly the back office, and also in some quite sensitive frontline services.
There's a traditional view that goes along the line that, well, there's terrible waste in these places, and if you just get rid of the paper clips and cut down on the stationery budget, you can sort all this out. I think the way you look to heaven, I suspect you think that can't be done in that way.
Well, I certainly think we're beyond any sort of cosmetic cuts of that sort. We are going to see some significant cuts in services like leisure and cultural services, and even I think in very sensitive frontline services like social services we will see some cuts, but it's very clear that local authorities are working hard to try to minimise reductions in those areas.
Do councils have the option to say, I mean, you get a debate in any organisation which is, do you do salami cuts across the whole organisation, Or do you say, right, well, we're no longer going to do parks. We'll let them grow, you know, we'll let the grass grow and we just won't have park attendants. Or we'll close the museums, we can't afford to run them.
Yeah, they have discretion in lots of areas. There are some services which are statutory and which they're required to deliver, but there are other services that are provided on a discretionary basis, and I think on this occasion we will see some of those services being closed in the way that you've indicated.
And you talked about sensitive frontline social services. Like what?
Like adult and children's care services, and I say again, I think it's very clear that local authorities are trying to protect those from cuts, but I think it would be very surprising if we don't also see some reductions in those areas.
But those are not statutory?
Well, they're not statutory in terms of the scale of service. It's very hard for a statute to define the level of service that has to be provided by the authority, and therefore there is some room for local discretion in those areas.
OK, well, we must leave it there. Siegfried, thank you very much indeed for coming to the studio to talk to us. Thanks so much.